My grandmother has always called Thanksgiving the most honest holiday. No presents to distract you, she'd say. Just people and food and whatever truth decides to show up at the table. She wasn't wrong. Last November, I was sitting across from her at my parents' house in Naperville, Illinois, cutting into a piece of pecan pie when I heard myself say the words that changed everything. "Grandma, I just want to say thank you again for the birthday gift. The $500 really helped with the move." She looked up from her plate slowly. The way she tilted her head reminded me of a bird who'd just heard a sound it didn't recognize. $500? She said. "My nephew stood in my room and told me that 67 years old. 67 years old." She set her fork down. The clink of it against the china plate was the loudest sound in the room. "Sweetheart," she said, and her voice was very quiet, "I sent you $15,000. I don't remember exactly what happened to my face in that moment. I know my mouth stopped working. I know my eyes went somewhere they hadn't planned to go. Straight to my mother, who was suddenly very interested in the sweet potato casserole she'd been serving for the last 30 seconds without actually putting any on anyone's plate. And to my brother, who was 26 years old and had just taken a long, slow sip of his sweet tea, like that was a perfectly normal thing to do. I started. 15,000, my grandmother said again. She wasn't raising her voice. She never raises her voice. That's the thing about her. She's 78 years old, and she grew up in Savannah, Georgia, and she has the kind of stillness that comes from a woman who has outlasted every storm she ever walked into. I wired it to your mother the week before your birthday. She said she'd handle the transfer since you just opened a new account and were having trouble with the routing number. Every single person at that table went very still. My father put his water glass down. My brother, whose name is Troy, did not look up from his plate. My mother finally stopped pretending to serve sweet potatoes. "Mom," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Mom, what happened to the money?" She looked at me and I watched something pass behind her eyes, something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite defiance but was somewhere in the ugly middle, and she said, "We had some things come up, honey. It was temporary. Troy needed." "Don't," Troy said quietly. "Troy needed help," my mother continued, like she hadn't heard him, "and it was going to be paid back before you even noticed." Before I noticed. I repeated the words like I was trying to understand what language they were in. Before I noticed that $15,000 was missing from my life. I want to tell you that I handled that moment with grace. I want to tell you that I stood up calmly and said something dignified and walked out into the cold November air with my head high. That is not what happened. What happened is that I sat there for probably 45 seconds, not saying anything, because I could not trust what would come out of my mouth if I opened it. My grandmother reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and that's the thing that finally made my eyes sting, because she was the one comforting me, and she was 82 steps removed from being the one who'd done anything wrong. Let me back up. I'm 31. I work as a dental hygienist in a practice outside of Chicago, which means I spend 8 hours a day with my hands in strangers' mouths and come home at night with aching wrists and a paycheck that is respectable but not excessive. I'm not complaining. I genuinely love my work. I love my patients. I love the odd intimacy of being trusted with someone's most vulnerable thing. But I am not a person with financial cushion. I am a person who tracks her grocery spending in a notes app and waits for Southwest sales. This past spring, my landlord sold my building. The new owners decided to convert the units to condos. I had 60 days to find somewhere new to live, which in the Chicago metro area is approximately enough time to panic, but not enough time to breathe. I found a place, a one-bedroom in a good school district, which mattered because I've been raising my daughter, Ren, mostly on my own since her father and I split up when she was 2. The new place was $300 more per month and required first, last, and security deposit up front. I told my grandmother about the situation on the phone in March. Not because I was asking for money, I wasn't, but because she's my grandmother and she asks how I'm doing and I tell her the truth. She's the one person in my family I've always been able to tell the truth to. 2 weeks later, she called me and said, I'm wiring some money to help with the move. I'm sending it through your mother because you mentioned the account issue. I want you to have it before you start packing. I told her she didn't have to. She told me not to argue with old women. I thanked her and said I'd call when it arrived. Then my mother called me and said, Grandma sent a little something. It should hit your account in a few days. And a few days later, $500 appeared, and I called my grandmother and said thank you, and she said, You're welcome, and I thought that was the whole story. I did not call back to clarify the amount. How do you call your 82-year-old grandmother and say, Hey, just double-checking, but how much exactly did you send? I kept thinking I'd misunderstood something. Maybe she'd said 1,500 and I'd heard 15,000 on that Thanksgiving afternoon. Maybe I was the one who'd made an error. I wasn't. I have the wire confirmation, my grandmother said at the table. She said it simply, the way you'd say something you've known for a long time. I can show you right now if you'd like. My mother opened her mouth. Helen, my grandmother said my mother's name once, quietly, and my mother closed her mouth. That was the first time I understood that my grandmother had known something was wrong for months. She'd been waiting. For what? I didn't know yet. I pushed back from the table. I need some air, I said, and I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair and I walked out through the garage because it was the fastest door. The temperature was 28 degrees. I didn't care. I stood in the driveway for a while and stared at the bare oak tree in my parents' front yard and tried to count backward from whatever I was feeling. $15,000? I had moved Ren and myself into a smaller apartment than I wanted because I thought I could only afford the deposit on a certain amount. I had sold a couch I loved because the new place had less space and I needed the cash. I had turned down a weekend trip with my college friends in September because I'd said I couldn't afford it, and I couldn't because I thought I had $500 of help from my grandmother and not $15,000. My brother came outside about 10 minutes later. Troy is 4 years younger than me and has what I would call a talent for surviving consequences that should have found him. He's been that way since we were kids. He borrowed $20 from me in high school and never paid it back. He borrowed my car in college and put a dent in it he never mentioned. Small things. Things I'd filed away without quite knowing I was filing them. He stood next to me in the cold with his hands in his pockets and I waited. I'm nephew stood in my room. Where did it go? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. I had some debt, bad kind. I needed to clear it fast and Mom knew and she was just trying to help me. With my money. I know. $15,000, Troy. I know. He looked at the ground. I'm going to pay it back. I already told Mom I'm going to pay it back. I looked at him standing there in the cold with his jacket unzipped because he'd come out in a hurry, and I felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was the specific exhaustion of being the responsible one in a family for 31 years. When? I asked. I'm working on it. I went back inside. My grandmother was still at the table. My mother had started clearing plates, which is what my mother does when she wants to look busy so she doesn't have to look at you. My father, who is a quiet man who has spent 35 years navigating the weather patterns of my mother's decisions without ever quite managing to redirect them, was refilling his coffee cup at the counter. Dad, I said. He turned around. His face looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed when I'd arrived that morning. Did you know? I asked. He took a long breath. I found out about 2 months ago. And? Your mother said it would be handled. I stood there for a second. I sold my couch, I said. I told Ren she couldn't go to dance camp this summer because I didn't think we could afford it. She's 5. She's been asking about dance camp since February. My father didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. My grandmother came and stood beside me. She put her hand on my arm and said, Come sit down with me. We sat in the living room away from the kitchen. My grandmother has the posture of a woman who decided decades ago that she would not let time bend her, and she sat very straight in the armchair across from me and folded her hands in her lap. "I owe you an apology," she said. I blinked. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I did," she said. "I knew something wasn't right when you called to thank me in the spring. The amount you mentioned I knew. I should have said something then instead of waiting." "Why did you wait?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted to believe your mother would fix it herself. She's my daughter. I've been giving her chances to fix things herself for 60 years. She paused. "I'm done waiting for that." I found out the full story over the following weeks in pieces. Troy had gotten into serious gambling debt, not with a casino, but with the kind of people you don't want to owe money to. My mother had known since January. When my grandmother's wire came through in March, my mother had looked at that money and made a decision. She transferred $500 to my account and rerouted the rest to cover Troy's debt. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself I wouldn't notice right away, and by the time I did, Troy would have paid it back. Troy had not paid it back. Troy did not have a plan to pay it back. Troy had, since March, borrowed an additional $3,000 from my parents' joint account, which my father also discovered around the time he found out about my money. My grandmother hired a forensic accountant. I want to say that sentence slowly because I still find it remarkable. My 78-year-old grandmother, who grew up in Savannah and still writes thank you notes by hand, hired a forensic accountant to trace the wire transfer and document exactly what had happened. She also spoke to her attorney. I didn't ask her to do any of it. I was still in the phase of sitting with it, trying to understand the shape of what had happened. It's a strange thing to realize that the people who raised you were capable of something you'd never imagined, not because they're monsters. My mother is not a monster. She loves me and she loves Ren, and she has shown up for us in real ways over the years. But because love doesn't stop people from making terrible decisions when they're scared, and their instincts about who to protect run in the wrong direction. My mother called me in December, not to apologize, not exactly. She called to explain, which is different. She went through the whole thing, how frightened she'd been, how certain she was that Troy would pay it back quickly, how she'd convinced herself it was a bridge loan more than a theft. She used the phrase, I was protecting my family, and I had to sit with the phone pressed to my ear and very carefully not say what I was thinking, which was, I am your family too. What I said instead was, I need you to understand that what you did changed something for me, not temporarily, permanently. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know. I nothing you do yet, I said, but maybe someday. The legal piece is still ongoing and I won't go into the details because some of it is still being sorted. What I can tell you is that my grandmother moved money from her own accounts to cover the amount Troy had taken, not because she was legally required to, but because she said she'd made me a promise, and a promise doesn't become someone else's debt because of how it gets mishandled. She wired it directly to me this time. She called when she sent it and stayed on the phone until I confirmed receipt. $15,212, including interest she calculated herself. I cried when I saw it in my account. I'm not embarrassed about that. Troy is in a court-mandated financial responsibility program and is repaying my parents the money he took from them separately. He and I haven't talked much, not because I've decided never to talk to him again, but because I genuinely don't know what to say yet, and I've stopped forcing myself to perform forgiveness I don't actually feel. My mother and I are in a strange, careful place. We talk, we see each other. She came to Ren's school performance in February and cried when Ren sang, and I stood next to her and felt the whole complicated weight of what it means to love someone you're also angry with. I don't know if that gets easier or if it just becomes a different kind of normal. Ren is registered for dance camp this summer. She doesn't know why the answer changed from no to yes. She just did a lap around the kitchen with her arms in the air and yelled, "Dance camp," loud enough for the neighbors to hear. That was a good day. My grandmother called me on my birthday in April. We talked for an hour and 15 minutes, which is not unusual for us. Near the end of the call, she said, Are you doing all right? Actually, all right, not the kind you say to not worry people. I thought about it. I think so, I said. I'm still processing some of it, but I'm okay. That's enough, she said. Okay is enough. You don't have to be anything else right now. I've thought about that a lot since. The permission in it, the way she said it like she meant it, like it was a fact rather than an encouragement, like she had looked at the whole situation and determined with great certainty that okay was sufficient and I didn't need to push myself toward anything more dramatic than that. She's right. Okay is enough. I'm not the same person I was before that Thanksgiving dinner. I don't mean that in a devastating way, just in the way that information changes you once you have it. I know things now that I can't unknow about my family and about what people are capable of when they're scared, and about the particular way that love can be real and still be not enough to stop someone from hurting you. I also know that my grandmother, at 78 years old, sat across from me at a holiday table and chose me without hesitating. She didn't wait for my mother to be ready. She didn't soften the truth to protect the room. She just put her fork down and told me what was real. I keep thinking about the forensic accountant. The image of her at her age, picking up the phone and making that call, not out of anger, but out of a kind of quiet, absolute determination to set something right. She didn't tell me she was doing it until it was done. She just did it the way she does everything, which is completely and without apology. I called her last week just to talk. No occasion. She'd been gardening, she said, which she does year-round as long as the ground isn't frozen. She asked about Ren. I told her about the dance camp registration and she laughed. The specific laugh she has for things that made her happy but also vindicating. Good, she said. That child should dance. I think about that conversation on the hard days, which there still are, honestly. There are still days when I think about my mother deciding to do what she did, and something in my chest pulls tight in the way that doesn't fully loosen. There are still days when I think about all the small things I denied myself and denied Ren during those months when I thought we had less than we did, and I feel a specific kind of anger about that. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that sits in the back of your throat. But then there's Ren asking me every single morning how many days until dance camp. There's my grandmother calling on a random Tuesday just to ask if the basil came back after the cold snap. There's my apartment, the one I actually wanted, where Ren has drawn pictures in chalk on the front walk that haven't faded yet. Thanksgiving was 6 months ago. The honest holiday, my grandmother calls it. She wasn't wrong about that either. There's a version of that Thanksgiving I used to replay where I said something sharper, where I stood up and laid out every consequence in perfect order and walked out with the kind of closure that feels satisfying when you imagine it at 2 a.m. That version doesn't exist. What actually happened was quieter and harder and, I think, more honest. What I keep coming back to is the chain of it, not in some abstract sense, but in the specific, traceable way that every choice in the story connected to the next one. My brother made a choice in January when he decided his crisis was more important than my stability. My mother made a choice in March when she looked at someone else's money and decided she could borrow from it without asking, and for months those choices compounded, not loudly, but in the small math of my life. A couch sold, a camp registration declined, a weekend trip turned down. Damage doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just quietly subtracts. I used to think that doing the right thing was its own protection, that if you worked hard and kept your accounts straight and didn't ask for things you didn't earn, you'd be insulated from this kind of loss. That's not true, and I think I knew it wasn't true, but it's a comfortable thing to believe when you're building a life on careful choices. What I understand now is that integrity isn't armor. It's just the thing you have left when everything else gets taken, and it turns out that's not nothing. My grandmother understood something I'm still learning, which is that clarity is a form of love. Not the comfortable kind of love that smooths things over to keep everyone in the room at the same temperature, but the kind that looks directly at what happened and names it without flinching. She didn't wait for my mother to come around. She didn't soften the number or give Troy another few months to develop a plan. She hired a forensic accountant. She called her attorney. She wired me the money herself and stayed on the phone until I confirmed it arrived. That's not sentiment. That's someone who decided that a promise meant something and then did the work to keep it. I think about what it takes to be that kind of person. It's not talent exactly, it's closer to a decision you make over and over in small situations and large ones, until it becomes the thing you reach for automatically. You tell the truth even when it makes the meal uncomfortable. You follow through even when it's inconvenient. You don't outsource your responsibility to someone else's timeline. My grandmother has been doing that for 78 years, and it shows in the way she moves through a room, not loudly, just with this settled quality. Like someone who has nothing to defend because she's never pretended to be anything she isn't. Ren starts dance camp in 6 weeks. She has asked me every single morning since registration how many days are left. This morning, she held up both hands and said, "This many," and then dropped one finger dramatically and said, "-1." I stood in the kitchen watching her and felt something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite defiance, but was somewhere between the two. This quiet, solid thing that I am keeping. Okay, I told my grandmother, is enough. I think she's right. But some days okay is also the beginning of something else.